Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten stories emerge from the shadows of history. Today, we examine a haunting discovery from the Victorian era that challenges everything we thought we knew about a seemingly peaceful departure. In the dim light of my study, I find myself drawn to an old photograph that arrived last week in a collection of Victorian memorabilia I purchased from an estate sale in New England. The yellowed image shows a man in repose, laid out in his coffin as was common practice in the late 19th century. His expression is calm, almost serene, his hands folded neatly across his chest. A beautiful silver pocket watch gleams softly in his waistcoat pocket. At first glance, nothing seems amiss in this memento mori. These death portraits were standard practice in Victorian times, when families would commission one final photograph to remember their loved ones. But something about this particular image has been haunting me since I first laid eyes on it 3 nights ago. Tonight I've decided to examine it more closely. The photograph is remarkably well preserved for something dating back to 1893, as indicated by the photographer's mark and date on the reverse. The subject appears to be a gentleman of some standing. His suit is well tailored, his beard neatly trimmed, and the coffin itself appears to be of fine craftsmanship. But it's the pocket watch that draws my attention tonight. Using my magnifying glass, I can just make out the time displayed on its face. 3:42. An odd time to stop a watch for a funeral preparation, wouldn't you think? Watches were typically stopped at the time of death. But something about this particular timepiece makes my skin crawl. Let me take you back to 1893, to a small New England town called Milfield, where our story begins. Perhaps then you'll understand why this simple photograph continues to disturb my sleep. Milfield, Massachusetts, June 1893. The summer of 1893 had been unusually hot in Milfield. The small industrial town, nestled between rolling hills and the rapidly flowing Blackwater River, was home to a prosperous textile mill that employed most of the local population. Among them was Edward Caldwell, a respected timekeeper at Blackwater Textile Mill. Edward's position was one of significant responsibility. In an age when precise timekeeping was crucial to industrial operations, he maintained and synchronized all the clocks in the facility, ensuring that shifts started and ended at the correct times, and that the complex machinery operated according to schedule. His personal pocket watch, a silver Waltham model with elaborate engravings, was renowned throughout Milfield for its exceptional accuracy. At 54 years of age, Edward was a pillar of the community, a founding member of the local Freemasons' Lodge, a deacon at St. Mark's Episcopal Church, and a devoted husband to his wife Margaret. Their modest but well-kept Victorian home on Elm Street was a testament to his meticulous nature and appreciation for order. On the morning of June 15th, Edward rose at precisely 5 a.m., as he had done every working day for the past 27 years. Margaret prepared his usual breakfast of soft-boiled eggs, toast, and strong black tea, which he consumed while reading the previous day's edition of the Milfield Gazette. "There's talk of expanding the mill," Edward commented, folding the newspaper carefully. "Mr. Richardson has apparently secured new contracts with buyers in Boston and New York." Margaret nodded as she poured more tea into his cup. "That should mean good things for Milfield, I suppose." "Indeed," Edward replied, checking his pocket watch, though change always brings its own complications. As he prepared to leave for work, Edward performed his daily ritual of winding and checking his prized timepiece against the grandfather clock in the hallway. Finding it perfectly synchronized, he placed it in his waistcoat pocket, kissed Margaret goodbye, and stepped out into the already warm morning air. The walk to the mill took precisely 12 minutes at Edward's measured pace. He greeted familiar faces along the way, Mr. Simmons opening his hardware store, Mrs. Fletcher sweeping the steps of her boarding house, young Thomas delivering newspapers on his bicycle. By 5:45 a.m., Edward had arrived at the imposing brick structure of the Blackwater Mill, its tall chimney already belching black smoke into the clear morning sky. He nodded to the night watchman, William Cooper, who was completing his shift. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," Cooper said, stifling a yawn. "All quiet through the night, though I must say there's been some strange noises coming from the new section." Edward frowned slightly. "The West Wing? It's not operational yet." "What kind of noises?" Cooper shrugged his shoulders. "Knocking sounds, like someone tapping on pipes. Probably just the building settling, but it gave me a fright around 3 this morning." "I'll have a look," Edward promised, making a mental note as he proceeded to his first duty of the day, unlocking the timekeeper's office and retrieving the master key that would allow him access to all the clock mechanisms throughout the facility. The timekeeper's office was a small but orderly space with various tools hanging neatly on the wall, technical manuals stacked precisely on shelves, and in the center, a large regulator clock that served as the standard against which all other timepieces in the mill were set. Edward hung his coat on the rack, placed his lunch pail on the desk, and removed his pocket watch from his waistcoat. After confirming it still matched the regulator clock exactly, he gathered his tools and began his morning rounds. His first stop was the punch clock room, where workers would soon be arriving to stamp their time cards. Edward ensured the mechanism was functioning correctly, then proceeded through the various sections of the mill, checking and adjusting clocks as needed. By 6:30 a.m., the mill was alive with activity. The massive looms clattered and thumped in rhythmic cacophony. Spinning wheels whirred, and hundreds of workers attended to their assigned tasks in the complex operation of converting raw cotton into finished textiles. Edward completed his morning rounds and returned to his office to record his observations in the timekeeper's log. It was there that Thomas Jenkins, the mill owner's young assistant, found him at 9:15 a.m. "Mr. Caldwell?" The young man appeared slightly out of breath. "Mr. Richardson would like to see you in his office right away." Edward raised an eyebrow. It was unusual for the mill owner to summon him, particularly at this hour. "Did he say what about?" "No, sir," Jenkins replied. "But Mr. Hargrove is there as well." That was even more curious. Jacob Hargrove was the foreman of the new West Wing expansion, which was scheduled to begin operations the following month. Edward had crossed paths with him only a few times, and something about the man's demeanor had always struck him as unsettling. "Very well," Edward said, returning his pocket watch to its place and standing up. "I'll go at once." The mill owner's office was located on the third floor of the administrative section, overlooking both the manufacturing floor and the river beyond. Edward knocked on the polished oak door, straightening his waistcoat as he waited. "Enter," came the authoritative voice of Howard Richardson. Edward stepped into the well-appointed office with its leather furniture, impressive desk, and large windows. Richardson, a corpulent man in his 60s with mutton-chop sideburns and a perpetual flush to his complexion, sat behind the desk. Standing by the window was Jacob Hargrove, tall, thin, with cold gray eyes and a neatly trimmed goatee. "Ah, Caldwell," Richardson said, not rising from his chair. "Thank you for coming so promptly. I've been discussing the timing systems for the new wing with Mr. Hargrove here." Edward nodded politely to both men. "Yes, sir. I've been preparing for the installation next week, as per your instructions." Richardson waved his hand dismissively. "There's been a change of plans. Mr. Hargrove has brought in a new automated timekeeping system from Switzerland. Latest technology. Quite remarkable, really." "I see," Edward said carefully, though in truth, he did not. This was the first he'd heard of any new system, and as timekeeper, such decisions typically involved his consultation. Hargrove spoke, his voice surprisingly soft for a man of his stature. "The Hoffman system eliminates the need for manual synchronization. All clocks are connected electronically. Much more efficient." He pronounced the final word with what seemed to Edward like thinly veiled condescension. "I'm not familiar with this system," Edward admitted. "I would be interested to learn more about its mechanics." "That won't be necessary," Richardson interjected. "Mr. Hargrove will oversee its installation and operation." Edward felt a cold sensation in the pit of his stomach. "I'm not sure I understand, sir. Are you suggesting this system will replace our current procedures?" Richardson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Not immediately, no. But eventually, yes. The West Wing will serve as a test case. If successful, we'll implement it throughout the facility by year's end." The implication was clear, and Edward struggled to maintain his composure. "And my position, sir?" Richardson wouldn't meet his eyes. "Your expertise will be valuable during the transition, of course. After that, well, we'll find appropriate duties for you, I'm sure." Edward felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. 27 years of loyal service, and his position was to be eliminated by some newfangled contraption he'd never even heard of. "I see," he said again, though his mouth had gone dry. "Is that all, sir?" Richardson nodded, clearly relieved the uncomfortable conversation was concluding. "Yes. Thank you, Caldwell. Carry on with your duties for now. Mr. Hargrove will coordinate with you regarding the installation next week." Edward nodded stiffly and turned to leave. As he reached for the door handle, Hargrove spoke again. Mr. Caldwell, I understand you're something of a horologist. That's quite an impressive timepiece you carry. Edward's hand instinctively moved to his waistcoat pocket, where his silver pocket watch rested. It was my father's, he replied curtly. Perhaps you'd permit me to examine it sometime, Hargrove suggested with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm something of a collector myself. Perhaps, Edward said non-committally, then left the office, closing the door behind him with careful restraint, though he wanted nothing more than to slam it. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Edward. He performed his duties mechanically, his mind consumed with the implications of the morning's meeting. 27 years of service, and soon his expertise would be rendered obsolete by a Swiss machine. What would become of him? At 54, with specialized skills in an apparently dying profession, what other employment might he find? And what would this mean for Margaret and their comfortable, if modest, life? By the time the final whistle blew at 6 p.m., Edward had worked himself into a state of quiet desperation. Rather than heading home immediately, he found himself walking toward Milfield's only public house, the Black Swan, somewhere he rarely frequented except for occasional Masonic gatherings. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," said James Foster, the barkeeper, as Edward entered the dimly lit establishment. "Don't often see you here on a workday, Edward." "Unusual circumstances call for unusual remedies, James," Edward replied, settling onto a stool at the bar. "Whiskey, please. A double." Foster raised his eyebrows, but poured the drink without comment. Edward took a larger swallow than he normally would, welcoming the burning sensation in his throat. "Rough day at the mill?" Foster inquired, wiping the bar with a cloth. Edward considered how much to share. Foster was known for his discretion, but Milfield was a small town, and gossip traveled fast. "Changes coming," he said simply. "Not all of them welcome." Foster nodded sympathetically. "Heard Richardson's bringing in new machinery from back east. Progress, they call it." "Progress," Edward repeated bitterly, taking another swallow of whiskey. "A fine word for making skilled men redundant." The barkeeper leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Speaking of Richardson, did you hear about his meeting with those Boston investors last week? Word is they're planning to double the size of the mill within 2 years. Under normal circumstances, Edward might have been interested in such news, but tonight he could only think about his own uncertain future. He finished his drink and was about to order another when a voice spoke from behind him. "Allow me to buy your next round, Mr. Caldwell." Edward turned to find Jacob Hargrove standing there, that same unsettling smile on his thin lips. The foreman pulled up a stool and sat beside him. "Mr. Hargrove," Edward acknowledged coldly, "I didn't take you for a patron of the Black Swan." "I'm new to Milfield," Hargrove replied smoothly. "I make it a point to familiarize myself with all local establishments." He signaled to Foster. "Another for Mr. Caldwell, and I'll have the same." Edward wanted to refuse, but found himself unable to formulate a polite rejection. The drinks arrived, and Hargrove raised his glass in a toast. "To progress," he said, with what Edward perceived as subtle mockery. Edward didn't respond to the toast, but took a sip of his whiskey nonetheless. The second drink was already making his head swim slightly. He was unaccustomed to strong spirits. "I sense you're unhappy about the new timekeeping system," Hargrove observed. Edward gave a humorless laugh. "Your powers of perception are remarkable." If Hargrove was offended by the sarcasm, he didn't show it. "Change is inevitable, Mr. Caldwell. The industrial world moves forward, and we must move with it or be left behind." 27 years, Edward said, more to himself than to his unwelcome companion. "I've given 27 years to Blackwater Mill, and I'm sure your service has been exemplary," Hargrove replied. "But surely you don't expect the mill to maintain outdated methods out of sentimentality." Edward felt a flash of anger. "There's nothing outdated about precision clockwork properly maintained by skilled hands. I've kept that mill running on perfect time for nearly 3 decades. Hargrove sipped his whiskey. "And now a machine will do it without requiring sleep, food, or wages. You can hardly blame Richardson for embracing efficiency." The conversation was making Edward increasingly uncomfortable. He finished his second drink more quickly than was wise and stood up, somewhat unsteadily. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Hargrove, my wife will be expecting me." Hargrove made no move to stop him. "Of course, but before you go, might I see that pocket watch of yours? As I mentioned, I'm something of a collector." Perhaps it was the whiskey clouding his judgment, or simply a desire to end the interaction, but Edward found himself removing the silver timepiece from his waistcoat and reluctantly handing it over. Hargrove examined it with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. turning it over in his long, pale fingers and studying the engraving on the case. Beautiful craftsmanship. Waltham model 1883, if I'm not mistaken. Your father had excellent taste. He was a railroad engineer, Edward said stiffly. His life depended on accurate timekeeping. Hargrove opened the case and studied the face and mechanism. Impeccably maintained. You do your profession credit, Mr. Caldwell. He handed the watch back, and Edward returned it to his pocket, oddly disturbed by having allowed the man to handle his prized possession. Good evening, Mr. Hargrove, he said curtly, placing coins on the bar to cover his first drink despite Hargrove's offer. As Edward turned to leave, Hargrove spoke once more. Change comes for all of us, Mr. Caldwell. The question is whether we adapt or perish. The walk home took longer than usual, as Edward's steps were less steady than they had been that morning. The summer evening was still warm, with fireflies beginning to emerge in the gathering dusk. By the time he reached his house on Elm Street, it was past 7:30, much later than his usual return. Margaret met him at the door, concern evident on her face. Edward, I was beginning to worry. You're never this late. I stopped at the Black Swan, he admitted, avoiding her eyes as he hung up his hat. Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise. The Black Swan? On a Thursday? She studied his face more closely. You've been drinking. It wasn't a question, and Edward didn't deny it. It's been a difficult day, he said, moving past her to sink heavily into his armchair in the parlor. Margaret followed, her concern deepening. What happened? Edward stared at the unlit fireplace for a long moment before answering. Richardson is installing a new automated timekeeping system in the West Wing. If it proves successful, they'll implement it throughout the mill. Margaret sat in the chair opposite him, understanding immediately. And your position? Will become obsolete, Edward confirmed, the words bitter in his mouth. Oh, Edward. Her voice was soft with sympathy. Did he say that outright? Not in so many words, but the meaning was clear enough. Edward removed his pocket watch and stared at it, as though the silver timepiece somehow embodied his predicament. 27 years, Margaret. What am I to do now? She reached across and took his hand. We'll manage, as we always have. You have other skills. The church has always valued your carpentry. Perhaps Mr. Collins at the watchmaker's shop could use an assistant. Or the railway station? They always need reliable men. Edward appreciated her attempt at optimism, but they both knew the reality of their situation. None of those positions would provide the steady income and respectability of his role at the mill. At his age, starting anew would be challenging at best, impossible at worst. We should eat, Margaret said, changing the subject. I've kept your dinner warm. Edward wasn't hungry but allowed himself to be led to the dining room, where he merely picked at the meat and potatoes Margaret had prepared. His mind was consumed with dark thoughts, and the whiskey had left him with a dull headache. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay awake beside Margaret, staring at the ceiling as the moonlight cast shadows through the lace curtains. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed each quarter hour, a sound that had always brought him comfort but now seemed to mock him. At 3 o'clock he gave up on sleep altogether. Carefully, so as not to wake Margaret, he slipped out of bed and made his way downstairs to his small study at the back of the house. There, by the light of a single lamp, he sat at his desk and removed a key from a hidden compartment in the drawer. The key opened a wooden box that contained his most prized possessions, his father's railroad certificates, his own Masonic documents, and at the bottom, wrapped in velvet, a small revolver that had also belonged to his father. Edward had never fired the weapon. He had kept it primarily for sentimental reasons and the occasional sense of security it provided during Margaret's rare overnight visits to her sister in Boston. Now he found himself turning it over in his hands, feeling its weight and the cold metal against his skin. What kind of man was he, to be so undone by the prospect of change? Had his entire sense of self become so entwined with his profession that he couldn't imagine life beyond it? But it wasn't just the loss of employment that haunted him. It was the loss of purpose, of relevance. In a world increasingly dominated by machines, what place was there for a man whose entire life had been dedicated to the careful maintenance of mechanical timepieces? Edward returned the revolver to its box, but didn't lock it away. Instead, he turned his attention to a sheet of paper, upon which he began to write a letter to Margaret. The words flowed more easily than he expected, expressing his love, his regrets, his fears for a future he couldn't envision. When he finished, he sealed the letter in an envelope, wrote Margaret's name on it, and propped it against the lamp. Then, with a strange sense of calm, he took his pocket watch from his waistcoat, which he'd draped over the chair, and wound it carefully. The time was 3:42 a.m. Edward didn't return to bed that night. What happened in those dark hours before dawn would become the subject of whispered speculation throughout Milfield in the days that followed. When Margaret awoke at 6 a.m. and found Edward's side of the bed empty, she assumed he had risen early, perhaps unable to sleep due to his troubles. She called his name as she descended the stairs, but received no answer. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Margaret checked the kitchen first, then the parlor, before noticing that the door to Edward's study was closed. Unusual, as he typically left it open. "Edward?" She knocked lightly, then tried the handle. The door was locked. A sense of foreboding came over her. Edward never locked the study door. "Edward!" She called more urgently, knocking harder. When there was still no response, panic began to rise in her chest. She hurried to the kitchen, where a spare key to the study was kept in a drawer. With trembling hands, she retrieved it and returned to the study door. The scene that greeted her upon opening the door would forever be seared into her memory. Edward sat in his desk chair, slumped forward, his head resting on the desk surface. Beneath him, a dark pool had spread across the polished wood. Next to his outstretched hand lay his father's revolver. "No!" Margaret's anguished cry echoed through the silent house. "Edward, no!" She rushed forward, still harboring some desperate hope that he might be alive, but the moment she touched his cold shoulder, she knew it was too late. A sob tore from her throat as she sank to her knees beside his chair. It was only after several minutes of uncontrolled weeping that she noticed the envelope with her name on it, now stained with her husband's blood. With shaking hands, she picked it up, unable to open it yet, clutching it to her chest as she continued to cry. Eventually, when her sobs had subsided enough for her to think clearly, she realized she needed to summon help. On unsteady legs, she made her way next door to the home of their neighbors, the Wilsons. Albert Wilson, still in his night clothes, was alarmed to find Margaret Caldwell on his doorstep at 6:30 in the morning, her face streaked with tears and her nightgown stained with blood. "Margaret, good heavens, what's happened?" "It's Edward," she managed to say between renewed sobs. He's gone. He's taken his own life." Wilson's face paled. "My God. Wait here. I'll wake Elizabeth and come right over." Within the hour, the Caldwell house on Elm Street had become the center of grim activity. Dr. Peterson had been summoned, as had Sheriff Taylor. Neighbors gathered on the street outside, speaking in hushed tones as they watched the official proceedings unfold. Inside, Dr. Peterson confirmed what everyone already knew. Edward Caldwell had died by his own hand, sometime in the early hours of the morning. The revolver had been fired at close range, the bullet entering just below his right ear. Sheriff Taylor, a gruff but compassionate man who had known Edward for many years, conducted a brief investigation. The suicide note, which Margaret had finally found the strength to read, made the circumstances painfully clear. "I cannot face a future of obsolescence," Edward had written. "Forgive me for my weakness, but I see no path forward in a world where men are replaced by machines. I have always prided myself on precision and reliability, qualities no longer valued in this age of so-called progress. Know that my love for you has been the one true constant in my life. Please forgive me." The sheriff awkwardly patted Margaret's shoulder as she wept anew upon sharing the contents of the note with him. "I'm truly sorry, Margaret. Edward was a good man. I can't understand what drove him to this." But Margaret understood all too well. Edward's entire identity had been built around his role at the mill. Without it, he had seen himself as without purpose. As the doctor and sheriff prepared to remove Edward's body, Margaret suddenly remembered something. "His pocket watch," she said. "He would want to be buried with his father's watch." Dr. Peterson checked Edward's waistcoat pockets but found them empty. "It doesn't seem to be on him, Mrs. Caldwell." Margaret frowned. "That's impossible. Edward never went anywhere without it." A thorough search of the study and the rest of the house failed to locate the silver Waltham timepiece. It was as though it had vanished into thin air. "Perhaps he lost it yesterday," Sheriff Taylor suggested. "He stopped at the Black Swan, didn't he? Maybe he left it there." But inquiries at the public house proved fruitless. James Foster distinctly remembered seeing the watch when Edward had shown it to Jacob Hargrove, but was certain Edward had returned it to his pocket before leaving. The mystery of the missing pocket watch was soon overshadowed by the practicalities of funeral arrangements. In accordance with Victorian customs, Edward's body was prepared for burial and would lie in repose at home for 3 days before the funeral service at St. Mark's. Margaret, supported by her sister who had arrived from Boston upon receiving the tragic news, received visitors who came to pay their respects. Howard Richardson was among them, his florid face even redder than usual as he awkwardly expressed his condolences. "If there's anything the mill can do, Mrs. Caldwell. A pension, perhaps," he offered, clearly uncomfortable. Margaret regarded him coolly. "My husband gave 27 years of faithful service to Blackwater Mill, Mr. Richardson. He deserved better than to be cast aside for a machine." Richardson had no response to this, and soon made his departure. Conspicuously absent from the stream of visitors was Jacob Hargrove. Margaret had never met the man, but had heard Edward mention him briefly during their final dinner together. His absence was noted by others as well. "Strange that Hargrove didn't show," James Foster commented to Sheriff Taylor as they stood outside the Caldwell home after paying their respects. "Especially since he was probably the last person to speak with Edward at length." The sheriff's interest was piqued. "What do you mean?" Foster explained about the conversation he had witnessed between Edward and Hargrove at the Black Swan. "Seemed intense, from what I could overhear." Hargrove was doing most of the talking. "Something about progress and adaptation." Taylor frowned. "Might be worth having a word with Mr. Hargrove." But when the sheriff went to the boarding house where Hargrove was staying, he was informed that the foreman had left Milfield early that morning, claiming a family emergency in Boston required his immediate attention. This information, combined with the missing pocket watch, planted a seed of suspicion in Sheriff Taylor's mind. However, with no evidence of foul play in Edward's death, the suicide note was clearly in his handwriting, and the revolver bore only his fingerprints. There was little the sheriff could do beyond making a note in his report. On the day of the funeral, St. Mark's Episcopal Church was filled to capacity. Edward had been well respected in Milfield, and the community turned out in force to support Margaret and honor his memory. Reverend Simmons spoke eloquently of Edward's dedication to precision and order, qualities that had made him not only an excellent timekeeper, but a valued member of the church vestry. After the service, as the mourners followed the horse-drawn hearse to the cemetery, Margaret walked arm in arm with her sister, her black mourning dress and veil a stark contrast to the vibrant June day. Edward was laid to rest in the Caldwell family plot beside his parents. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Margaret stepped forward and cast a single white rose onto it. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered. "Find peace in God's eternal clockwork." In the days following the funeral, Margaret began the difficult process of adjusting to life as a widow. Her sister returned to Boston, though she offered to stay longer. Margaret, however, insisted that she needed to find her own way forward. The mill, perhaps out of guilt, did indeed provide a modest pension, though it was far less than Edward's salary had been. Margaret took in sewing work to supplement her income and sold some of their less essential possessions. Life became simpler, harder, but she endured. As summer gave way to autumn, the controversy surrounding the new automated timekeeping system at Blackwater Mill provided a bitter vindication. The Hoffman device, installed with much fanfare in August, proved unreliable. Synchronization failures led to production delays, and by September, Howard Richardson was quietly seeking a replacement timekeeper, though none had Edward's expertise. Jacob Hargrove never returned to Milfield. Rumors circulated that he had moved on to another mill in Pennsylvania, where similar automation was being implemented. Others whispered that he had never actually gone to Boston at all, but had fled with embezzled funds from the mill. Without evidence, these remained merely rumors. And so life in Milfield continued, the tragedy of Edward Caldwell gradually fading from public consciousness, remembered primarily as a cautionary tale about the dangers of progress without compassion. But for Sheriff Taylor, one question remained unanswered. What had happened to Edward's pocket watch? Boston, October 1893. The auction house on Commonwealth Avenue catered to Boston's elite collectors. On this crisp October evening, the crowded showroom buzzed with excitement as rare timepieces from various estates were presented for bidding. "Our next item," announced the auctioneer, "is a silver Waltham pocket watch, model 1883, with exceptional engraving and in remarkable condition. Originally the property of a railroad engineer, it comes with an interesting provenance." In the front row, a man with cold gray eyes and a neatly trimmed goatee leaned forward in his chair, a satisfied smile playing on his thin lips as the bidding began. "Sold to the gentleman in the front row for $300, the auctioneer declared. Jacob Hargrove nodded in acknowledgement, pleased with his acquisition. As he collected his purchase, he opened the case to admire the watch's face once more. The hands were frozen at 3:42, the exact time they had stopped on the night Edward Caldwell had taken his final breath. Or so it appeared. Milfield. Same evening. Margaret Caldwell sat alone in her parlor, a letter in her trembling hands. It had arrived that morning, postmarked from Boston, with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping, an advertisement for the auction of various timepieces, including a silver Waltham pocket watch that matched Edward's in every detail. Accompanying the clipping was a brief note, written in an unfamiliar hand. Some things are worth more than their mechanisms. Your husband discovered this too late. Margaret stared at the words, a cold sensation spreading through her chest. For months she had accepted the official account of Edward's death, but now doubt began to creep into her mind. She rose and went to her husband's study, which she had preserved exactly as it was, unable to bring herself to clear away his belongings. From the drawer where Edward had kept his important papers, she retrieved his suicide note and studied it again. The handwriting was indeed his. She would recognize it anywhere. But something about the phrasing had always struck her as odd, though in her grief, she hadn't dwelled on it. I cannot face a future of obsolescence. I see no path forward in a world where men are replaced by machines. It sounded like Edward, and yet not like him at the same time. The sentiments aligned with his distress over the changes at the mill, but the language, Edward had always been plain-spoken, practical in his expression. These words seemed somehow more dramatic, more fatalistic than his usual manner of speech. Margaret's gaze drifted to the desk where her husband had died. The bloodstain had been cleaned away, but she could still see it in her mind's eye. Something about the scene had bothered Sheriff Taylor as well. He had mentioned it almost in passing during his investigation. Strange that he'd use his right hand for the gun, the sheriff had mused. Wasn't Edward left-handed? At the time, Margaret had been too overwhelmed with grief to consider the implications. People did unusual things in moments of extreme distress, after all. But now, with the mysterious note and the news of Edward's watch being auctioned in Boston, she found herself questioning everything. Could someone have forged the suicide note? Could Edward's death have been something other than what it appeared? And if so, what did the pocket watch have to do with it? Boston. 1 week later, the elegantly furnished office on Beacon Hill belonged to one of Boston's most prestigious private investigators, Thaddeus Montgomery. Margaret Caldwell sat rigidly in a leather chair across from his desk, her black mourning clothes a stark contrast to the rich mahogany furnishings. "So you believe your husband's death may not have been suicide, Mrs. Caldwell?" Montgomery asked, his keen eyes studying her face. Margaret hesitated. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Mr. Montgomery. The evidence certainly points to suicide. The locked door, the note in his handwriting, the gun in his hand. And yet something doesn't feel right to you," Montgomery finished for her. "In my experience, a widow's intuition is often worth more than a dozen police reports. Tell me about this man, Hargrove." Margaret recounted everything she knew. Jacob Hargrove's arrival in Milfield to oversee the installation of the new timekeeping system, his conversation with Edward at the Black Swan the night before his death, and his abrupt departure from town immediately after. "And you believe this man now has your husband's pocket watch?" Montgomery asked. "I can't be certain," Margaret admitted. "But the description in the auction listing matched Edward's watch exactly, down to the engraving. And then there's this note." She handed him the anonymous message she had received. Montgomery examined it thoughtfully. "Interesting. Some things are worth more than their mechanisms. What do you make of that?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't know. But Edward's watch was no ordinary timepiece. It had been his father's, and before that, his grandfather's. It was precision-made and kept perfect time. Edward often said it was the finest example of the watchmaker's art he'd ever encountered." "Valuable enough to kill for?" Montgomery asked directly. Margaret flinched at the bluntness of his question. In monetary terms, perhaps not extraordinarily so, but for a collector obsessed with rare timepieces. Hargrove did express unusual interest in it, according to Mr. Foster at the Black Swan. Montgomery made some notes in a small notebook. "I'll need to look into Mr. Hargrove's background and current whereabouts. If he purchased the watch at auction, there will be records, and I'll need to examine the original police report from Milfield." Sheriff Taylor was thorough, Margaret said, but even he had questions he couldn't answer, like why Edward would use his right hand when he was left-handed. "Indeed," Montgomery murmured, "and the missing watch. Curious that it would disappear on the night of his death, only to reappear at a Boston auction house months later." He closed his notebook and looked directly at Margaret. "This investigation may lead to uncomfortable truths, Mrs. Caldwell. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Montgomery?" I've spent 4 months believing my husband took his own life because he couldn't face a changing world. If there's another explanation, any other explanation, I need to know it. Very well. He nodded. I'll begin immediately. Where are you staying in Boston? With my sister on Marlborough Street. I'll write down the address. As Margaret prepared to leave, Montgomery had one final question. The pocket watch. Was there anything distinctive about it besides the engraving? Anything that would make it identifiable beyond doubt? Margaret thought for a moment. Yes. Inside the case, Edward had etched his initials and a date, June 15th, 1866. It was his 10th birthday, when his father first showed him how to maintain the watch. Edward said it was the day he knew he would devote his life to timekeeping. Over the next 2 weeks, Thaddeus Montgomery conducted a meticulous investigation. He traveled to Milfield, where he interviewed Sheriff Taylor, James Foster, and other townspeople who had known Edward Caldwell. He examined the police report and visited the Caldwell home, paying particular attention to Edward's study. In Boston, he traced the provenance of the pocket watch sold at auction, confirming that it had indeed been purchased by Jacob Hargrove, who was now employed as a consultant for a machinery manufacturing company headquartered in the city. Most significantly, Montgomery obtained permission to exhume Edward's body, a process that required Margaret's formal request and approval from a judge. The exhumation was conducted quietly, with Dr. Peterson from Milfield in attendance alongside a Boston medical examiner. The findings were delivered to Margaret in Montgomery's office on a gray November afternoon. Rain streaked the windows as the private investigator reviewed the evidence he had gathered. Mrs. Caldwell, based on my investigation, I believe your husband did not take his own life, Montgomery stated without preamble. The medical examiner's report indicates that the angle of the gunshot wound is inconsistent with self-infliction, particularly for a left-handed individual. Furthermore, there were traces of chloroform in the tissue samples, suggesting your husband may have been unconscious when the fatal shot was fired. Margaret pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Then it was murder? I believe so, yes. And I believe Jacob Hargrove is responsible. But the note, Margaret protested weakly. It was in Edward's handwriting. Indeed it was, Montgomery agreed. But I consulted a handwriting expert who noted subtle inconsistencies, pressure points and stroke patterns that suggest the note may have been written under duress or influence. He spread several documents on his desk. My theory is that Hargrove, upon learning of your husband's valuable pocket watch, developed a plan to acquire it. He deliberately provoked Edward's anxiety about his position at the mill, then met him at the Black Swan, where he may have drugged his drink. But why would Edward go home with him afterward? Margaret asked. He wouldn't need to, Montgomery explained. Hargrove likely followed Edward home, waited until late, then gained entry to your house. Perhaps Edward had been careless with locking up due to his distressed state. Using chloroform to render Edward unconscious, Hargrove forced him to write the suicide note, staged the scene, and took the watch before departing. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. All this for a pocket watch? It seems unthinkable. For an ordinary pocket watch, perhaps, Montgomery conceded. But I've learned that Mr. Hargrove is no ordinary collector. He has a reputation among certain circles for his obsession with historically significant timepieces, particularly those associated with technological transitions, like the replacement of human timekeepers with automated systems. He handed Margaret a folder. These are articles from various newspapers describing similar incidents over the past 5 years. Skilled timekeepers in different industries who supposedly took their own lives during periods of technological change. In each case, a valuable watch or clock disappeared. Margaret leafed through the clippings with growing horror. You think Hargrove is responsible for all of these? I can't prove it conclusively, Montgomery admitted, but the pattern is striking. And in each case, Hargrove was present in the vicinity around the time of death, often as a consultant introducing new automated systems. But why send me the note about the auction? Why take that risk? Montgomery's expression darkened. That, Mrs. Caldwell, suggests a particularly disturbing aspect to this case. I believe Hargrove derives satisfaction not just from acquiring these timepieces, but from the knowledge that the families of his victims are aware of what he's done, yet powerless to prove it. Margaret felt cold revulsion wash over her. He's taunting me. Precisely. The note, some things are worth more than their mechanisms, could be interpreted as a philosophical statement about the value of human life versus machines. But I believe it's actually Hargrove's twisted justification for his actions. To him, These watches gain value through their association with the deaths of the men who maintained them. My God, Margaret whispered. Can you prove any of this? Can he be brought to justice? Montgomery sighed heavily. Therein lies our challenge, Mrs. Caldwell. The evidence, while compelling to us, remains circumstantial. Hargrove is well connected in Boston society. Accusing him without irrefutable proof would be dangerous. So he simply gets away with murder? With Edward's murder? Anger replaced Margaret's shock. I didn't say that, Montgomery replied carefully. There are other approaches we might consider. For instance, recovering your husband's watch would be a significant step. With the watch in our possession, we could confirm its identity through the initials you mentioned, establishing a direct link between Hargrove and Edward. How would we accomplish that? Surely he keeps it secured. Hargrove resides in a townhouse on Mount Vernon Street. My sources indicate he keeps his collection in a special room there. With the right strategy, it might be possible to gain access. Margaret's eyes widened. You're suggesting breaking into his home? I'm suggesting that justice sometimes requires unconventional methods, Mrs. Caldwell. Montgomery's tone was measured. I have contacts who specialize in discreet acquisitions. For a fee, they could retrieve the watch without Hargrove's knowledge. Margaret fell silent, considering the implications. Everything within her proper Victorian upbringing recoiled at the suggestion of theft, even for a righteous cause. And yet, the thought of her husband's murderer possessing Edward's beloved timepiece, gloating over it as a trophy, filled her with determination. If we recover the watch, she said slowly, what then? Would that be enough to convict him? Perhaps not on its own, Montgomery admitted, but it would give us leverage. Hargrove values his reputation in society above all else. The threat of exposure, combined with physical evidence linking him to Edward, might compel him to flee, which would be its own admission of guilt, or perhaps make a mistake that provides the definitive evidence we need. Margaret took a deep breath. Do what you must, Mr. Montgomery. I want my husband's watch returned, and I want Jacob Hargrove to answer for what he's done. Boston, December 1893. Snow fell gently on Mount Vernon Street, blanketing the elegant brick townhouses in white. The gas lamps cast a warm glow through the winter darkness as a lone figure made his way along the deserted sidewalk, his footsteps muffled by the fresh snow. Samuel Wright, one of Montgomery's specialists, approached the Hargrove residence with practiced nonchalance. His instructions were clear. Gain entry through the service entrance, locate the collection room on the second floor, retrieve only the silver Waltham pocket watch, and leave without a trace. Wright had conducted reconnaissance over several days, observing Hargrove's habits and household routine. Tonight, Hargrove was attending the Boston Symphony Orchestra's performance of Tchaikovsky, followed by a late supper at his club. The housekeeper had the evening off, and the only other staff, a manservant, had been seen departing earlier with a small valise, suggesting he wouldn't return until morning. The townhouse stood dark and silent as Wright made his way around to the rear alley. Using specialized tools, he quickly defeated the lock on the service entrance and slipped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The interior was opulent, with expensive furnishings and artwork visible even in the dim light provided by Wright's shuttered lantern. He moved silently through the kitchen and servants' quarters, then up a narrow back staircase to the main second floor. According to Montgomery's intelligence, Hargrove's collection room was located at the end of the hallway, a converted bedroom now dedicated to his obsession with timepieces. Wright found the door locked but managed to open it with his picks. The room that greeted him was extraordinary. Display cases lined the walls, each containing watches, clocks, and chronometers of various designs and eras. A large desk dominated one wall, covered with watchmaking tools and magnifying devices. The steady ticking of dozens of timepieces filled the air with an eerie chorus. Wright raised his lantern higher, scanning the displays for Edward Caldwell's silver Waltham. Montgomery had provided a detailed description, including the distinctive engraving on the case. After several minutes of careful examination, Wright located it in a glass-topped case near the desk. As he lifted the watch, Wright noticed a leather-bound book on the desk beside it. Curiosity prompted him to examine it, and what he found sent a chill down his spine. The book was a meticulous journal, with entries corresponding to each timepiece in the collection. Next to a sketch of Edward's pocket watch was a handwritten note. E. Caldwell, Milfield, acquired June 16, 1893. Time of death, 3:42 a.m. Method, right temple, staged as suicide after chloroform administration. Subject particularly attached to timepiece. 3 generations. Excellent addition to the transition collection. Wright quickly produced a small camera from his coat and photographed the journal entry, then carefully replaced the book exactly as he had found it. With the watch secured in an inner pocket, he retraced his steps through the house and out the service entrance, locking it behind him. The snow had continued to fall, already covering his earlier footprints. By morning, there would be no evidence of his visit. Thaddeus Montgomery's office was warm and brightly lit the following afternoon as Margaret Caldwell held her husband's pocket watch in trembling hands. The familiar weight of it, the intricate engraving she had polished so many times. There was no doubt this was Edward's prized possession. "Open the case," Montgomery suggested gently. "Confirm the initials you mentioned." Margaret did so, revealing the watch face, still stopped at 342, and inside the cover, the small etching, EC June 15, 1866. Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the initials with her fingertip. "It's his," she whispered, "beyond any doubt." Montgomery nodded gravely. "And we have more." He spread several photographs on his desk, images of Hargrove's journal entry documenting Edward's murder. Wright found this in Hargrove's study. It's a detailed record of his collection. Margaret read the entry with growing horror. He keeps a trophy record, like a hunter, more like a connoisseur cataloging his acquisitions, Montgomery replied grimly. But yes, essentially a record of his kills. Wright photographed several pages. There are at least a dozen similar entries dating back to 1887. "This is monstrous," Margaret said, her voice hardening. "Surely this is enough to bring charges against him." Montgomery's expression was cautious. "The journal provides compelling evidence, but there remains a significant legal problem. The photographs were obtained through illegal means, breaking and entering. No court would admit them as evidence." "Then what was the point of all this?" Margaret demanded, frustration evident in her voice. "The point, Mrs. Caldwell, was twofold. First, to recover your husband's watch, which we've done. Second, to confirm our suspicions about Hargrove and understand the full extent of his crimes. Now that we have this knowledge, we can pursue other legal avenues of investigation, such as..." Montgomery leaned forward. "With your permission, I would like to share this information with authorities in other jurisdictions where similar deaths occurred. While our evidence may not be admissible, it can guide official investigations. Perhaps one of Hargrove's other crimes left more conclusive evidence." Margaret considered this. "And in the meantime, Hargrove remains free? He'll know someone took the watch. What if he comes after me?" "I've arranged for discreet protection for you," Montgomery assured her. "As for Hargrove, he indeed reported a burglary this morning. But interestingly, he claimed only that some cash and silver items were taken. He made no mention of the pocket watch. He doesn't want police scrutiny of his collection," Margaret realized. "Precisely, which gives us another advantage. Hargrove doesn't know that we have evidence of his crimes. He believes this was a random burglary." Margaret's fingers closed around Edward's watch. "So we wait for the law to catch up with him?" "That could take years, if it happens at all." Montgomery's expression was carefully neutral. "There are other considerations, Mrs. Caldwell. Hargrove's journal mentioned a transition collection. This suggests his killings follow a specific pattern related to technological change. If that pattern continues, there will be more victims," Margaret finished, a chill running through her. "It seems likely, yes, unless he is stopped." The implication hung in the air between them. Margaret studied Montgomery's face, sensing he had more to say but was hesitant to voice it. "You have a suggestion, Mr. Montgomery?" The investigator chose his words carefully. "Justice can be pursued through various channels, Mrs. Caldwell. Sometimes the official mechanisms of the law are insufficient to address certain types of evil. In such cases, private justice might be the only recourse." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing specific," Montgomery interrupted smoothly. "Merely observing that you now possess information about a dangerous individual who has caused immeasurable harm and is likely to continue doing so. How you choose to use that information is, of course, entirely your decision." Margaret fell silent, turning the pocket watch over in her hands. The weight of it, the significance of what it represented, not just her connection to Edward, but the instrument of Hargrove's obsession, the reason for his murder, pressed heavily on her conscience. "I need time to think," she said finally. Montgomery nodded. "Of course. Whatever you decide, I remain at your service." As Margaret prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "The watch, it still stopped at 342. Is that when—" "According to Hargrove's journal, yes. That was the time of Edward's death." Margaret looked down at the watch once more, then made a decision. She opened the case and wound the mechanism carefully, just as she had seen Edward do countless times. The familiar ticking resumed, steady and reassuring. "No more stopping time," she said quietly. Edward wouldn't want that. Boston, January 1894. Jacob Hargrove's townhouse on Mount Vernon Street was illuminated brightly against the winter evening. Inside, a dinner party was underway. Hargrove entertaining several influential businessmen and their wives, potential investors in his latest venture, automated manufacturing systems for the textile industry. In the dining room, servants moved efficiently around the table, pouring wine and serving an elaborate meal as Hargrove expounded on the inevitability of progress. "The human element," he was saying, "while charming in its way, is ultimately the weakest link in any industrial process. Machines don't tire, don't make errors of judgment, don't require wages or pensions." "But surely there's value in experience," objected one of the guests, a silver-haired mill owner from Lawrence. "My head timekeeper has been with us for 30 years. His understanding of our operations can't simply be replaced by gears and springs." Hargrove's smile was condescending. "A common sentiment, Mr. Patterson, but ultimately sentimental, rather than practical. I've overseen dozens of transitions from human timekeepers to automated systems. After an initial adjustment period, efficiency invariably improves by at least 15%. "And what becomes of the displaced workers?" asked a woman seated near the foot of the table. She was modestly dressed compared to the other ladies present, introduced earlier as Mrs. Wilson, a widow whose late husband had been involved in manufacturing. Hargrove glanced at her with mild annoyance. He had invited her at the insistence of one of his potential investors, who had described her as a distant relative with an interest in modern industry. Her question struck him as tedious, the predictable concern of someone lacking vision. "Progress always creates casualties, Mrs. Wilson," he replied dismissively. "The skilled blacksmith gave way to the iron foundry, the handloom weaver to the power loom. Those who cannot adapt must, regrettably, be left behind." The woman held his gaze longer than was comfortable. A convenient philosophy for those implementing the change rather than experiencing it. An awkward silence fell over the table, broken by Hargrove's forced laugh. "Indeed, change is easier to advocate than to endure, but such is the nature of advancement. Now, shall we move to the library for brandy? I have something rather special I'd like to show you, gentlemen. A recent acquisition for my modest collection of timepieces." As the party relocated to the library, Mrs. Wilson, in reality Margaret Caldwell in disguise, exchanged a brief glance with one of the servants, who gave an imperceptible nod. During dinner, while all attention was on Hargrove's discourse, the servant had slipped upstairs and made certain adjustments to the collection room, as per Margaret's instructions. In the library, Hargrove poured brandy for his male guests, while the ladies were offered sherry. He then moved to a cabinet and withdrew a small velvet case. "This," he announced with evident pride, "is a pocket chronometer that once belonged to Admiral Nelson. Authenticated by experts at Christie's, it's one of only 3 timepieces known to have been in his possession." As the guests admired the historical artifact, Margaret sipped her sherry and observed Hargrove carefully. His obvious delight in possessing objects of significance, particularly those with connections to notable figures, confirmed everything Montgomery had learned about his pathology. When conversation turned to other topics, Margaret excused herself to use the powder room. Instead of returning directly to the library, however, she made her way to the second-floor hallway and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, there was a commotion from the collection room, a crash followed by the sound of breaking glass. Hargrove came bounding up the stairs, his face flushed with alarm. "What was that?" one of the female guests called from below. "Nothing to concern yourselves with," Hargrove replied tersely. "Please continue enjoying your drinks. I'll return shortly." He hurried past Margaret without really seeing her, his attention focused on the partially open door of his collection room, from which a thin tendril of smoke was now emerging. Margaret followed silently, watching as Hargrove burst into the room and froze in horror at the sight that greeted him. One of the display cases had toppled over, shattering several valuable timepieces. More alarmingly, a small fire had started near his desk, the flames beginning to consume his precious journal. "No!" Hargrove lunged for the burning book, beating at the flames with his bare hands. In his panic, he didn't notice Margaret enter the room behind him, nor did he hear her close and lock the door. It was only when the fire was extinguished, the journal partially saved but his hands painfully burned, that Hargrove became aware of her presence. He turned sharply, his expression changing from pain to confusion. "Mrs. Wilson, this area is private. You shouldn't be here." Margaret stood with her back against the door. "You don't recognize me, Mr. Hargrove? I suppose there's no reason you should. We never formally met in Milfield." Hargrove's confusion deepened, then gave way to dawning comprehension. "Milfield, you're not Mrs. Wilson." "No," she confirmed, removing the decorative comb that had altered her hairstyle. "My name is Margaret Caldwell. Edward Caldwell was my husband." The blood drained from Hargrove's face, but he quickly composed himself. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm sorry for your loss. Your husband's suicide was a tragedy." "It wasn't suicide," Margaret said evenly. "We both know that. Just as we both know that my husband's pocket watch was in your collection until recently." Hargrove's eyes darted to the empty space in one of the intact display cases, the space where Edward's watch had been. "I don't know what you're talking about. I experienced a burglary last month. Several items were taken." "Yes, including a silver Waltham pocket watch with an engraving of oak leaves and acorns. My husband's watch." Hargrove's expression hardened. "This is absurd. I think you should leave, Mrs. Caldwell. Whatever delusions you're harboring about your husband's death are confirmed by your own journal," Margaret interrupted, gesturing to the partially burned book in his hands. "The journal that documents your murders in meticulous detail, including the fact that you administered chloroform to Edward before staging his suicide, a fact that was confirmed when his body was exhumed last month." Real fear flickered in Hargrove's eyes now. "Exhumed? On whose authority?" "Mine, with the support of an excellent private investigator and a sympathetic judge." Hargrove glanced at the door behind her, calculating. "Whatever you think you know, you can't prove anything. That journal is damaged beyond legibility now, and no court would accept evidence obtained through burglary." "You're right," Margaret acknowledged calmly. "I can't prove anything to a court's satisfaction. That's why I'm not here to threaten you with legal action." A tense silence fell between them. Hargrove's gaze hardened. "Then why are you here, Mrs. Caldwell?" Margaret reached into her handbag and withdrew Edward's pocket watch. "To return something that belongs in your collection." Hargrove's eyes fixed on the timepiece with naked desire, momentarily overwhelming his caution. "You brought it back? Why?" "Because it's the instrument of your undoing," Margaret replied, opening the case to reveal that the watch was now ticking. "I've wound it for the first time since Edward's death. Time is moving forward again, Mr. Hargrove, including the time you have left." Confusion crossed Hargrove's face. "What are you talking about?" Margaret placed the watch carefully on a small table between them. "Did you know that Edward was not only skilled with timepieces but also with chemistry? The textile industry requires extensive knowledge of dyes and their properties. Edward conducted experiments in our home laboratory for years." Hargrove's confusion gave way to alarm. "What have you done?" "The inner case of this watch has been treated with a particular compound. Colorless, odorless, but highly toxic when absorbed through the skin. You handled this watch for quite some time after taking it from Edward, didn't you? Admiring your trophy?" Hargrove stared at his hands, the same hands now bearing fresh burns from the fire. "You're bluffing. This is a desperate attempt to frighten me." "Perhaps," Margaret conceded. "Or perhaps you've been slowly poisoned over the past 6 months. The symptoms would have been subtle at first. Occasional dizziness, numbness in your extremities, minor memory lapses. Recently, you may have noticed more troubling signs, unexplained bruising, difficulties with balance or coordination, possibly even brief moments of confusion." The color drained further from Hargrove's face as she described precisely the symptoms he had indeed been experiencing but had attributed to overwork and stress. "The compound is arsenic-based," Margaret continued, "but modified through one of Edward's experimental processes. It's untraceable through standard methods, particularly after death, when it mimics natural decomposition effects." "You expect me to believe that your husband, a mill timekeeper, created an untraceable poison?" Hargrove scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. "I expect you to die within the next 3 months," Margaret replied matter-of-factly, "regardless of whether you believe me." She stepped away from the door. "You can call the police if you wish. Tell them a grieving widow is making wild accusations. But consider this. Drawing attention to yourself means your collection will be scrutinized. The pattern of your acquisitions might become apparent even without my help. And if they were to examine your health closely, who knows what they might discover?" Hargrove remained silent, his mind racing through the implications. "I'll leave you to your dinner party," Margaret said, moving toward the door. "And to contemplate which is worse, the uncertainty of not knowing if I'm telling the truth, or the certainty that if I am, nothing can save you. Either way, Mr. Hargrove, you'll experience what Edward and your other victims felt, the helplessness of watching your time run out." As Margaret left the collection room, she heard Hargrove's anguished voice behind her. "Wait, there must be an antidote. Name your price." She paused but didn't turn around. "Some things are worth more than their mechanisms, Mr. Hargrove. Good night." Milfield, April 1894. Spring had come to the small New England town, bringing with it renewal and change. Margaret Caldwell sat on a bench in the cemetery beside Edward's grave, which was now adorned with fresh flowers. In her hands, she held his silver pocket watch, its steady ticking a comforting rhythm. The Boston newspapers had reported the strange death of Jacob Hargrove 2 weeks earlier. A man of apparent good health, he had succumbed to an undiagnosed illness that had caused progressive deterioration over several months. Doctors had been baffled by the combination of symptoms, which had eventually led to organ failure. There had been no suspicion of foul play. More interestingly, Hargrove's will had contained an unusual provision. His extensive collection of timepieces was to be distributed to the families of various individuals in different towns across New England and the mid-Atlantic states. The specific beneficiaries had been listed in a separate document found in his desk. Thaddeus Montgomery, visiting Milfield to pay his respects at Edward's grave, now approached the bench where Margaret sat. "Mrs. Caldwell," he greeted her, removing his hat. "You're looking well." "Mr. Montgomery," she acknowledged with a small smile. "Thank you for coming. Please join me." He sat beside her, his gaze moving to the pocket watch in her hands. "I see Edward's timepiece has found its way home." "Yes," Margaret confirmed, "along with a considerable financial settlement from Mr. Hargrove's estate. Apparently he felt remorse in his final days and sought to make amends to those he had wronged." Montgomery's expression revealed nothing. "How providential, and the other families received similar restitution?" "So I understand. Each received a timepiece and financial compensation." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Montgomery spoke again. "I've always wondered, Mrs. Caldwell, that night at Hargrove's townhouse, what exactly did you say to him to prompt such a dramatic change of heart?" Margaret's fingers traced the engraving on the watch case. "I simply helped him understand the value of time, Mr. Montgomery. How precious it is, how quickly it can run out, and how meaningless possessions become when one's own clock is winding down. A profound philosophical lesson," Montgomery observed. "Indeed," Margaret agreed, "though I suspect it was the practical demonstration rather than the philosophy that truly affected him." Montgomery raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, he glanced at Edward's gravestone. "Do you think your husband would approve of how things were resolved?" Margaret considered the question carefully. Edward believed in order, in precision, in things working as they should. When mechanisms fail, they must be repaired or replaced. Justice is its own kind of mechanism, wouldn't you say? "An intriguing perspective," Montgomery nodded. "And now, what will you do?" Margaret closed the watch case and slipped it into her pocket. "Begin again. I've accepted a position at Collins' watchmaking shop. It seems I learned more from Edward's work than either of us realized. Mr. Collins says I have a natural talent for the intricate mechanisms. A fitting tribute to your husband's legacy," Montgomery said, rising to his feet. "I should return to Boston. Should you ever require my services again, Mrs. Caldwell, I know where to find you." She completed his thought. "Though I suspect our business is concluded." As Montgomery departed, Margaret remained on the bench, her hand resting over the pocket watch in her pocket. Its steady ticking matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. Constant, reliable, moving forward. Time, as Edward had always maintained, waited for no one, not even those who sought to control it. Returned to present day. In my study, I carefully placed the magnifying glass down beside the photograph of the serene-looking man in his coffin. The pocket watch visible in his waistcoat pocket shows the time as 3:42, a detail most would overlook, but one that led me down this rabbit hole of Victorian intrigue. Whether Margaret Caldwell actually poisoned Jacob Hargrove or merely convinced him she had, playing on his guilty conscience until his own mind manifested physical symptoms, remains one of those historical mysteries that will never be fully resolved. What we do know is that Hargrove's collection was indeed distributed to families across the Northeast, many of whom had lost loved ones under suspicious circumstances involving technological transition. And in the Milfield Historical Society, Edward Caldwell's silver Waltham pocket watch, remains on display, still keeping perfect time, more than a century after its owner's death. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself contemplating that photograph, the serene expression of a man who appears at peace in death, but whose story reveals the violent disruption of progress without compassion, obsession without conscience, and ultimately, justice without courts. The Victorian era's fascination with death portraits has left us with thousands of such images, somber, dignified memorials to the departed, but this particular photograph serves as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Look closely enough at the details, and even the most peaceful scene might reveal a darker truth. Thank you for joining Shadow Frames today. If you enjoyed this exploration of hidden histories, be sure to subscribe for more stories that emerge from the shadows of the past. Until next time, remember to look beyond the frame. The truth is often hidden in plain sight.